Good morning, grade 8. I know it's been a while, and I thought of doing a review on a document like I did for Bible, and I thought, wow, it's kind of annoying to do all the reading. In Bible, it worked out a little nicer because I was assigning questions to you. And this way, for language arts, I've been asked to do a lot of note reflection. And so, what I thought I would do this morning is I would take some time to go over the novel so far from the beginning to chapter 10, and then that would set you up for the assignment that's coming tomorrow. And then that will also perhaps give you some answers you may be looking for, or we'll create questions and then you can email me your questions or comment below the video, etc. So, never done a YouTube, well, I've done YouTube videos before, but not in this format. So, we'll give it a go. And if you hear screaming babies in the background, well, welcome to the Josie house. And that's part of the reason why it's a little harder to do videos like this just whenever I want. I gotta go make sure the kids are quiet, etc. So here goes. So hopefully you've been enjoying the novel. I really do. I always appreciate reading this. I think I've read it a dozen times at this point. Eric Walters is a great author. He's got a great backstory. For example, for myself, I think of him as a teacher, and then that gives him great insight into writing these style of books too, because yeah, he knows what teens are like. He knows who Ian actually is, and I can relate to that. And so maybe you can relate to Ian in a unique way, and I can relate to Eric Walters. Shattered essentially is a novel about a young teen's discovery of what homelessness is all about, addictions is all about, and Rwanda, or if you pronounce it properly, Rhonda. You see that somewhere in chapter 9 or 10 or something like that. So, Eric Walters, who is he? Well, he's a Canadian author. He's local, and he was a teacher for many years, and he worked also in a hospital, and he was passionate about English. I think he was an English teacher specifically, and he was passionate about getting kids who don't like to read reading, and that has spawned a career that's very diverse. He writes books about all kinds of topics, and Africa holds a special place in his heart, particularly Central Africa. He runs an orphanage there, and it's a really neat program that he's got running because he every dollar that you donate to his program is a dollar directly invested into the orphanage or associated with that. The administration costs are minimal, and that's a unique way of running an NGO, which is essentially what that is, which connects to geography. So here we get Shattered. We get a boy named Ian who is about to learn all these things. And before you began, I asked you to complete a page called a cat's page. And that cat's page covered things like, well, what does the cover show you? And what does the back cover show you? And what do you learn about the author? And so on and so forth. So we see on the back cover, we see a hand with no fingers for the glove. It's pushing against a door, but that door says push on the other side. So it's almost like the guy, the publisher is trying to send a message. This guy's pushing against what actually is supposed to. He's going the wrong way. And that really, as you read through chapter 10, and perhaps some of you have read the whole novel, that's really what Sarge, the homeless friend of Ian, that's really what Sarge's life story. He's going against the normal route. Here's a soldier, former soldier, essentially a hero, and he's come across he's made some life choices that are not good, and he's had some consequences happen to him. And yeah, there's a nice little image there to start us off. And then we get a little forward by Romeo Dallaire. Romeo Dallaire is a famous Canadian military individual. He also, like Sarge, his whole family was in the military before him, and Dallaire talks about a new type of injury, a new type of calamity associated with war now in the modern era, and that, of course, is referring to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We also had a couple quotes that I asked you to deal with. One quote was from Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin's quote is, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And in a way, that's really, really true right now. We're going through COVID-19 and a crisis associated with that. And we're in the early days of it. It's hard to believe because it's been a few weeks at home. But we really are in the early days. And, you know, if you've done any reading, you know that in 1918, the Spanish flu terrorized the world and millions upon millions of people died. But it's got very little emotional impact on me because, well, it's a million people. Millions of people. But this one seems a little bit more shock and awe, and that's probably because the numbers are so low right now. It's early days. We've got only a few hundred deaths there. That's a better light, maybe. Still looking a little bright. Oh well. And it's very small, and the impact in Italy, the impact in China doesn't seem to emotionally connect with us so much, but that's so much bigger. You got hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people, many thousands of deaths. And here in Canada, we've got, you know, several thousand people with it, but we only have a few hundred deaths so far. And so it's going to be even more when the first couple deaths start to trickle in that are directly associated with our community. That's going to have a greater impact than we can believe. I'm going to try to change the light for a sec. That's a little better. Anyways, I was getting off topic there. The biggest thing is that when something is individual or minimal, or you can still have a smaller number attributed to it, it's a bigger deal. Whereas if you become overwhelmed, then you don't see the forest from the trees or the trees from the forest so much anymore. There's also a quote there from Edmund Burke. It's also a famous quote. "All that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing." Now, that's not a very reformed worldview. Evil is prevailing because of man's fall into sin. But the idea that it's prevailing unallowed is for good men to do nothing. And when I think of that, I don't think of tragic events. I just think of the situations in life where we, don't speak up to that neighbor about not taking the Lord's name in vain, or when we don't, chastise our classmate for doing something blatantly wrong. Those are situations where good men are doing nothing. So it's here goes that brightness again. Anyways, let's get into chapter 1. So the forward by Romeo Dallaire is all about soldiers with new struggles, and when we open up the chapter, we don't have those quotes and that forward coming home yet. We learn about Ian, and you can take Ian a couple different ways, but he's the type of student that pretends he doesn't care. He's a rich kid. He's this only child by all accounts. And he has to take the civics course. Now, you guys won't take civics till grade 10, so we got to get an idea of what age level he's at. And he's looking forward to becoming 16. And he's looking forward to that especially because he gets a car. And he knows that he's wealthy enough that he's probably going to get a BMW, which is a higher-end car. So we meet this Ian, and he's on his way to a place called the club. And while he's on his way, it's cold outside. We get a little bit more of an introduction into who he is. He's someone who likes to party. He's someone who thinks he's cooler than he really is. He's too cool for school. He's popular, and he's on his way to the park or onto the club, and he's going a little bit late, and he sees this park, and he's going to cut through. So he's also a little naive, and here he runs into some trouble, and so he meets a homeless person who asks for some change, and then there's a couple other people, and he calls them bums. And then he meets this one character who kind of causes him to pause. And this character's well spoken, and this character's not slumped over, and this character's got good posture. Of course, we know now that this character's name is Sarge. Then he gets himself into some trouble. He's cut through the park, and he runs into three men, and they want his coat and they want his shoes because they can tell by how he's dressed that he's a little rich. Ian finds himself in trouble, and we know how the rest of the story goes. Ian's gonna get in trouble, and he's gonna lose his coat. He's gonna lose his money. He's gonna lose his shoes. And then the man he had met steps up to the plate and basically lays a beating on these guys. He takes on all three, and the kid, Ian, safely gets out of the park. And that's quite an event for a kid who grew up well-to-do, has never come across any of these situations, is pretty wealthy, and probably just never found himself on the opposite end of the bullying sphere. So it's an interesting introduction into this kid, and it's a education for him as he's on his way to this place called the club. We're not really sure what the club is yet. That gets to chapter 2. And that's where I asked you to read chapter 2 and 3. And so we learn about the club, and the club is this homeless shelter, not for a place for sleeping, but for feeding. It's basically a soup kitchen. And it's run by a guy by the name of McDonald, or also Mac. For short. And Mac and Ian have an interesting first interaction because Ian's thinking this is all official. I have an interview. I'm late for my interview. And Mac's just like, I got a helping hand. Awesome. And the best part that Mac appreciates about Ian is that Ian doesn't hide why he's there. He's there to get his credits so that he gets his course, so that he passes, so that he gets a BMW when he turns 16. It's all self-serving. So our early understanding of Ian is this self-serving guy. Our early understandings of Mac is he's like this guy who runs the club, and the club is a soup kitchen. And then we also get Eric Walters' first impressions about what church is all about, and his opinions of church. And there's two kind of comments that are made in chapters 2 and 3. And one is about the do-gooders, the volunteers, who come in and create more harm than good. And the second perspective is the idea of Mac kind of doing this as a calling. Mac having this role at the club, running the club as some sort of calling, which is it's Christian language to talk about things like a calling. That's chapter 2 and 3 in a nutshell. And I asked you to reflect on the club. What is the club? Mac. What did Mac think about Ian? And what kind of opinion does the author have about church? And the opinion of the church is do-gooders, kind of self-serving. They float in, they do a little bit of work so that they feel good, and then they leave and they don't do much else, or they come in trying to convert everybody right away, and that creates all kinds of agony and stress and pain for the regulars. The next one was chapter 4. As I turn to chapter 4, there Oh yeah, we talk about Mac being a no-nonsense guy. He knows how to run this place. He's been around the block a few times. Chapter 4, we're brought back to the classroom. And we get a little bit of an introduction into Mrs. Watkins. And Mrs. Watkins is a no-nonsense teacher, and she's working in a civics class, and she's obviously assigned the students to do this project. So she's the type of person that wants to push her students to do more than they think they can, and she wants to push them for growth. She's also one who sees through Ian. Ian's this too cool for school guy who is full of himself, self-serving, and she also knows that she can probably get more out of this kid. And so she's going to push him, and that's where the Lester B. Pearson assignment came out of. Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister, who, before he was Prime Minister, created basically what we know as peacekeeping branch of the United Nations, the Blue Berets, which is pivotal as it comes out later in chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 6. No, chapter 5, sorry. It's day 2 at the club. Ian's mom's driving him there, and we get a little bit of an education on Ian's mom. A little bit of like, do you have to do this? Rough part of town. She's worried about the safety of her son, but she's also worried about like just the dirty aspect of it all. And Ian kind of bites up against it. He's disrespectful. He doesn't honor his mother. He's even kind of ashamed to get dropped off in the fancy Mercedes outside the club. But we see Ian's perspective start to change. We see how Eric Walters is slowly moving the character of Ian away from this rich kid who doesn't know anything to a kid who maybe cares more than he lets on. And we see that because he's wearing old coat, old shoes. He's better suited for the environment and for the day. And there's even a nice line there on page 45. She's complaining about his dress. He says, hey, it's better dressed down, than I won't get ripped off. I won't get stolen from. And then she's like, oh, Ian, don't be so dramatic, which is funny because that's exactly what happened to him in chapter 1. Anyways, so he gets dropped off and he can't find Mac. So he goes around the alley and he sees Mac unloading a truck, so he helps him unload a truck. And he's kind of learning about the club a little bit more and all the food and where they get the food. And he's also learning that it's just Mac. There's no other employees. There's no one else there. And then we get an introduction also to the individual called Berta. And Berta's this nanny. And it turns out, of course, that as the story goes, that Berta's actually a closer mother figure to Ian than actually his own mother. So they serve spaghetti that night, and what else did I want to point out in that chapter? Oh, and then we get our first real interaction with a homeless person at the club, and a little bit of a crazy situation because the guy's convinced that Mac might be an alien trying to poison him. So Mac kind of bluffs his way through that, and all the while Ian is learning more and more about who Mac is and what the club's all about, and he's also getting an education on what's going on. And then, of course, the author brings back Sarge. We don't really know his name yet, but that's what the end of chapter 5 is. We know now that this guy's name is Sarge. He was a sergeant in the army, or at least that's the story on him. And they have a little brief conversation when he serves them food. Chapter 6 is the street walk. So they're done for the night. They've done the dishes, and Mac's going to go on his rounds. It's going to go below freezing, and he wants to go check up on some people. And this is where we really start to learn more about homelessness. And that's why I asked you to reflect on homelessness. And here we get a picture of people who are living, or surviving rather, and why are they there? They're mostly there on the street, according to Mac, because of mental illness or addiction, which is true. And they're gathered around shelters or dumpsters, particularly if they're not in a state of mind to go to a shelter. Then they live in a dumpster, and there's this whole conversation where Ian's like, "Oh, they're gonna go live in the garbage," and Max says, "Well, it keeps them out of the rain, it keeps them warm, and this isn't. There's types of garbage. This is garbage from a furniture factory, which is soft and going to be a whole lot better than garbage out of a restaurant or something like that." Moving on to chapter 7, as this carries on a little bit longer than I wanted. Chapter 7, we get into, so Ian gets picked up, and then we learn a little bit more about Berta. She's from Guatemala. She's essentially Ian's mother figure. When he calls her, she calls him Eon, and she gives him a little nickname, Karina Mayo, which means my dearest. And then she also starts to reveal some things that Ian doesn't really know, and that's, like she can relate to what's going on in the neighborhood around the club, because she's seen this in her home country too. And we start to see more of a character shift in Ian as he truly starts to care a little bit more. In the beginning of the novel, he's truly there about his car, and he still pretends that he is. He wants that car, he wants to pass the course, it's all selfish. But emotion is starting to play a role, and he's starting to actually really, really care about what's going on and what he's learning. Continuing through chapter 7 and 8, we get back to a scene with Mrs. Watkins. Mrs. Watkins is a little bit surprised, a little bit impressed with how Ian has cared so much. He did 6 hours of service on a Friday night. And we find out that it had some social consequence for Ian. He missed out on a party. And so in class, she gets Ian to present a little bit, and she also gives an assignment on interviewing a military person, because she's also talking about United Nations peacekeeping, and so she wants to educate her children a little bit more on that. And then they have this little thing at the end of chapter 8 where they talk about the dehuman way in which we interact with those who are on the streets, those who are homeless. And we talk about them like bums or drunks, and they're nuts, they're crazy, they're street people. And we do that. And I want to pause on that point a little bit, because as humans, when we use dehumanizing language, then we've made them less than ourselves. And when we do that, then it almost subconsciously gives us permission to do it more, and to treat them as less, and to ignore them, and to same thing happens when you talk about American slavery, the history of American slavery, and also the same thing's happening with abortion. The obsession with calling it a fetus or a lump of cells. Why? Because if you dehumanize it, all of a sudden, somehow in the social conscience, then it becomes easier for these people to accept, easier for them to justify. And so that we see this also happening in the homeless situation. So that's at the end of chapter 8. So is Ian changing his attitude? Yeah, you can see him starting to actually care. Whether or not he admits it to himself is just he's on the cusp of doing that. But he is genuinely starting to care. You can also see it in how he interacts with his peers during his presentation. He calls them jerks, and they don't understand, they don't care. So we see the character starting to develop a little bit more. Chapter 9 and 10, the last 2 chapters I'm going to review as I wrap this up. The first thing I want to point out is on page 87. So if you turn there with me, a beautiful little interaction here. There's some helpers at the club that night, a couple of church ladies, And we're coming back to Mac's opinion about these church ladies, and they kind of do more harm than good, but yeah, you can't deny the fact that they need the help. So you kind of hate the do-gooder aspect, but love the help and need the help. And so Ian has this little judgment. All three of them had big hair, bright colored dresses, and buttons that read "Jesus saves." Apparently, judging from the jewelry they were all wearing, Jesus had been saving up for diamonds and fancy earrings. I just love that line. I think Eric Walters is really showing his opinion there, but also makes me think too as a Christian. We talk a good game, and yet we still, um, we live a luxurious life. Might not feel like it. Maybe you in a household where, like me, you wear secondhand clothes and you buy what's on sale, and going out is a real special occasion. But comparatively to these men here, we're living pretty luxuriously. So I love that description. I just wanted to pause on that for a minute. So Ian is taking on Mac's opinion about these ladies. He hates the do-gooder aspect, but yeah, they need the help. There's only two of them, so now there's five, and that makes Ian's job. And then Ian has this little transition because now is the first time he gets to interact with the actual patrons, if you want to call them that, because he has to come from behind the counter and he has to go serve, and he's pouring juice and he's collecting trays and so on. And of course, Ian is eager to interact with Sarge. He wants to interview him for this assignment. So he's looking and he's looking and he's looking, and finally when Sarge comes and he jumps in line and he serves him, he mentions this to him, and then he waits a little while to go sit down with him. Just to back up a hair. So what is it that Ian doesn't like about these ladies? That they're self-righteous, that they're self-serving. They come when it suits them and then they leave again, and they kind of are doing this work more for their own needs than for the actual needs of the people there, which is interesting because at the start of the novel, those are kind of the same reasons why Ian was there. But you see his shift. You see how he's changing as a character, because now that rubs him the wrong way. Now he doesn't like that. So as a reader, we see him actually caring. He wants to be there and he wants to help. Back to Sarge. So he meets Sarge and he says, "Hey, I want to interview you. You were in the military, and I got to ask you some questions for school." And he goes to sit down with Sarge, and then he's like taken aback. This guy reeks of alcohol. And we learn that Sarge is an alcoholic. And there was clues to that already, because when they went on their street walk, then they were looking in that little tent commune area in the park, and Sarge had turned in for the night, but there was bottles everywhere. So it's not a total shock to Ian, but it is because Sarge has become this little bit of an elevated character. Anyway, so he interviews Sarge, and he learns that he was a military man, that he's married, and that we know from his interaction with Mac that this guy's been around the streets for about a year and a half. And so he's asking about his military career, etc., etc., etc. And then something sets him off, and that's Eric Walters setting the stage for chapter 11 and 12, which you probably have started to read already if you haven't read it already. And that is that Sarge gets on the topic of Rwanda, and Ian has no idea. He's never heard of it. And I would assume that for most of you, that's the same. So you have to imagine something being incredibly tragic, affected someone very deeply, socially and emotionally, and then you interact with someone who has no clue. And it's hard to take. It's like someone, I had an Opa that got Alzheimer's, and it essentially took his life in the end. Terrible, terrible disease. I would have a hard time if some ignorant person just started to, make fun of it. Like that would, especially if I'm a little bit immature, like, or emotionally unstable, that would be really hard to take. As an adult, maybe I won't, flip my lid, but still. And that's kind of what Sarge goes through. So Ian's like, I have no clue what Rwanda is. And then Sarge, which obviously Rwanda has dramatically affected his life, Sarge is like, how could you have no idea? And then he leaves. And that's the end of the interview. That's the end of chapter 10. So that's setting the stage for chapter 11. And it leads us as the reader to be like, okay, well, what's all Rwanda about and what's going on with Sarge here? So chapter 1 through 10 is mostly and primarily a character development stage for Ian. Ignorant, selfish, too cool for school kid. And by the end of chapter 10, especially as he goes home and he digs into Rwanda a little bit, you find out that, he's taken a whole 180 shift. He cares now. No more mention of the car or the birthday or whatever. He's grown and matured as a character. He really starts to care about what he's seeing and interacting and learning about. And we're going to see that transition in the back half of the chapter. Ian continues to develop, but then we're also going to see at the end of the book that also Sarge is going to develop. And he's going to change and transition as a character. So I hope that this half-hour review kind of walked you through all the questions. Tomorrow there's going to be an assignment posted about assignment number 2. You've done assignment number 1, Lester B. Pearson. Assignment number 2 is coming. You've also had a vocab assignment on, I believe those the first 10 chapters as well. So that's part of it, and it'll connect to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is connect to the second assignment, and yeah. Let me know if this worked for you. Let me know if this is a better way, and maybe we'll do some more in the future. So, anyways, it's nice to virtually see you, and I hope you have a good day, good rest of your day. Bye.